Welcome, everybody, to today's Building My Legacy podcast. I have with me today Hart Kaminker. Did I pronounce that correctly? Kaminker.
That's
Why
correct.
don't you pronounce it for us so people get the right accent?
So Kaminker, but you were pretty close.
Okay. And Hart is located in Toronto, Canada. He specializes in immigration law and for people who want to immigrate to Canada. And right now, immigration, at least here in the United States, that is one hot topic. So tell us a little bit about what got you started in immigration law and what your passion is around it.
Okay, so how I got started is really just something that I fell into. After I got called to the bar a number of years ago, I was looking for work, and the firm that offered me a position happened to do immigration, and it wasn't something I think that I had thought about seriously while going through law school, but just happened to be where I could get a job, and I never looked back after that. I mean, and I think, or I have enjoyed it, and I think one of the, I guess, great things about it is being able to help people in a way that you can see a tangible result, and helping people, in a very important way, and in helping them change their lives. So that's very rewarding.
So where do you see immigration coming from the most right now in Canada? What kind of people do you deal with the most? From what countries?
Okay, so the countries that I deal with are pretty broad, but I would say, if I were to say where, a majority came from, and it wouldn't be like a huge majority, it would be South Asia, like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, that area, and then as well the Middle East. So I would say those would be the two big areas: Egypt, Iraq, Syria. These would be the places where I would say the majority of my clients came from, although I don't know that that's necessarily reflective of where the majority of immigrants are coming from, although Canada does get a lot of immigrants from South Asia. But I'm not sure that my practice would necessarily be reflective of that. But my practice is very broad. So in the sense that I practice in all different areas of immigration. So I do asylum claims. On the other hand, I do help professional and skilled workers come to Canada. I help companies who are looking to hire foreign workers or have identified a specific foreign worker that they need for their company, helping them to get, through the hoops to be able to bring that person to be able to work legally. So that also broadens the places where my clients come from. So, for example, take a look at the corporate side. A lot of those people, some of them are South Asian, but some may be Western European as well.
Got it. So for you, with what you're having and you're finding, what are some of the biggest barriers that people face in coming to Canada? So here, and I'll tell you why I asked that question. Here, sure. It seems if you try to do it legally, it takes a long time. If you try and do it illegally, it goes really fast.
So, yeah, I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case here. I think, whether, regardless of how you come to Canada, I would say the biggest challenge is just moving, through the bureaucracy and the red tape that you need to get through in order to get residence in Canada. And, depending upon the pathway that you take, that bureaucracy or red tape would be different. But I would say that would be the biggest hurdle. I mean, right now in Canada anyways, has significant backlogs of applications that were created during the pandemic, when the processing of applications slowed down a lot because offices were closed or were understaffed, whether those are offices that are in Canada or that those are visa posts overseas. So I think that that's obviously a challenge people are facing now in getting their application, processed as fast as they would like it to.
Okay, so one of the things that you also talk a little bit about, or that I understand that you do work in, is U.S. to Canada. And a large part of that, I'm guessing, surrounds the issue of working both ways. And especially like for us, we're Minnesota. So if you're from northern Minnesota, there's that fluidity across the border, right?
Right, right.
So how is that? What are things that companies really need to think through when they hire for their workers from like the U.S.?
Okay, so the U.S. would be a particularly, I guess, different example than, let's say, coming from other countries in the world. Let's, whether that's Asia or whether that's Europe, because of the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States, that allows for freer movement of some personnel between Canada and the United States. So a freer movement would be professional people, so accountants, doctors, lawyers, engineers. It could also include computer programmers, and it can also ease the movement of people who are investing in Canada. So Americans that are looking to invest in businesses in Canada may have a faster route to get a work permit to work in the business they've invested in Canada. And as well, if companies have branches both in Canada and the United States, to be able to move their personnel. So I think when you're looking at a U.S. employer or a Canadian employer looking to hire a U.S. employee, would be looking at, firstly, what's the easiest way to get them here, and without sort of going into all of the legal complexities of it. The general rule is that when a Canadian employer wants to hire a foreign worker, which would include a U.S. worker, they have to show, there's a process that they have to go through where they have to show they can't find a Canadian resident or citizen, Canadian permanent resident or citizen to do that work. The U.S., but you can bypass that process. In some cases, the U.S. does provide more opportunities to bypass that process. So in some ways, if you're looking for a particular kind of employee, let's say an engineer, for example, going to the U.S. may be a better place to go than perhaps some other country, just because it may be easier to bring that American worker to Canada than it might be to bring a worker from another country.
Got it. So what are some of the biggest things a company really needs to think through ahead of time? Say they're debating this, they're thinking about it. How do they need to plan? Obviously, call somebody like you.
Yeah. And so I think what they need to really think through is, because I have an employer or people who will call me, and the employer will be a better job. Going back to the issue of, you have to advertise the position. The Canadian government has, relatively limits on where that advertisement has to be and what the content of the advertisement needs to be, and even what the wage, at least the minimum wage, let's say, that you have to offer the employee. And so, the employer has to, I think through about, if I advertise this, they might find, in their travels, they might find somebody, hey, I'd really like, that's a great person, I really want that person to come work for me. But then they obviously have to get the permission to work. I think the employer has to really think through about, like, can I find somebody here? And if I can find somebody here, who probably is maybe as competent as this other person whom I happen to really like, or could do the job, or I couldn't convince the government they couldn't do the job, then there's really no point in going through the process. And often, I'll tell the employer, look, you're in a better position. I might not know the industry. I don't know your industry. You're in a better position to tell them, to know whether or not whether there are people in Canada that can do this work or whether there's not. And so that's often, if there's no way of getting around the recruiting requirement, as I said, there are some exceptions to that rule, even for overseas people who are, not American, then I think that's the first starting point, the first question. And if they say, look, no, we can't find somebody, or it's going to be difficult, then they may not want to go through the process. And the other is, you have to really, because there is auditing on the backside. So somebody hires a foreign worker, they say, I'm going to pay them this wage, they're going to do this work. It's registered with the government. The government will come back and say, show us your payroll records of what you've paid this person, where this person's been working, proof of where this person's been working. So employers have to be cognizant of and if you can't do that, then there can be, significant financial penalties. So the employer, again, has to be aware of, like, when you hire a foreign worker, you're committing to that person. I mean, most of the time that's the case, because most of the time an employer is going to come, with an issue of hiring somebody foreign, really on the basis that this particular person with this particular skill set can't be found in Canada. and therefore, and I really need them to do X in my company. And so they're very motivated to try to bring that person in.
So, are there things that make it not possible for a person to be strongly considered? Like, are there one of the things that you've mentioned in the past is DWIs, for example, or DWIs, right? Or are there other infractions that a person could have gotten that would keep them?
Right. So a criminal record is, yes, an issue that can keep somebody out of Canada, whether they're American or wherever they might be coming from in the world. So that's something an employer should be aware of, that, you know, if an employee hasn't disclosed a criminal record in the past, which sometimes they don't to the employer, that, you know, should this come, because it's one of the questions that the employee, if they get to the point of getting the permission from the government to hire the foreign worker, then the employee applies for the work permit. In that process, they're going to be asked whether they have a criminal record, and you know, if they disclose that they do, then that's it's a complicating factor, complicating enough that it would lead to the refusal of the application, and to correct that would be a length, and depending on how long ago the criminal conviction was and what the criminal conviction was, there may be ways to correct that, but that's not a fast process. And so that's, you know, definitely something an employer has to think about. Like, do I need somebody to do this job now and not 6 months from now or 8 months from now when that process can be fixed? And so that person's, you know, just not a candidate because we can't wait that long.
God. So what's interesting about that is some of the countries that you're looking at or that you have more applications from, Bangladesh, Syria, for example, some of those people have been in prison for political reasons, perhaps, but they have a criminal record. And what do you do with those?
Okay, so, you know, like I would say, like from Syria, those would be more asylum seekers than necessarily workers. But I mean, if somebody's had been involved, you know, one thing, you know, to say is that if you've been convicted of a crime outside of Canada, which is, you know, 9 times out of 10 the case. I mean, there may be a case you might come across somebody that visited Canada that had some kind of conviction. It's come up, I think, once or twice in the many years I've practiced. But if somebody's been convicted of a crime outside of Canada, that to keep that person from coming into Canada also has to be a crime in Canada. It has to be equivalent. There has to be an equivalent to a crime in Canada. So, you know, if somebody had was politically active in the past and had some run-ins with the government for political reasons only, there may be a way to resolve that issue because it's not equivalent to, it may not be equivalent to any offense here in Canada. Again, it doesn't necessarily uncomplicate the situation, because it is a complication that you would need to address, which could slow down the processing of the application.
Got it. So when you work with people, how often do people get rejected for visas or for coming to the U.S. to work or to immigrate?
Yeah. So luckily, rarely. Because the idea, you know, if you're looking at issuing like work permits or permanent resident permits, people have applied for permanent residence. It's rare, and the only reason for that is usually, you know, if there are, you know, in the consultation process, let's call it, and when problems are identified, you know, we try to identify issues or problems are going to come up. So if issues or problems are identified, either the employer or the applicant, if it's a private client coming in, let's say it is a skilled worker, we'd say, look, this is potentially a problem, or look, we don't think this is going to work. And so we never sort of get past that consultation process about what the person wants to do or whether the person's qualifications will allow them to make a successful application. Or on the work permit side, if there's complications, an employer might say, no, that's, you know, we just can't proceed ahead with it because of the complication that have ensued. That have ensued. So the other potential complication in Canada is health. So if one of the applicants either the applicant or the spouse or perhaps child has a serious health issue. On the work permit side, it may or may not be an issue, but often people who are coming to Canada to work are not all, often, I would say, not always. People who are coming to Canada to work are looking ultimately to use it as a bridge to permanent residence in Canada. And so you have to say, well, we might be able to get through the work permit process, but this is definitely going to be a barrier once we get to permanent residence. And then that can change people's minds about, okay, do we really want to, if they're a young family, do we want to pick up where we're living and move all the way to Canada and then have to leave because we can't ultimately get permanent residence?
So tell me, what happens if you're an employer and you've brought somebody in because they've got a special skill that you want, and they come and then you realize they really do not work out in your culture, or maybe they don't have the skill sets that you really thought that they had? What does an employer do in that situation? Does the immigrant go back home? Yeah.
Okay. So it's like two separate issues, and this is a question that does come up, not infrequently. Yeah. So it's two separate issues because you're dealing with the issue about whether an employee works out or not, whether, maybe their skill set quite isn't as strong as perhaps the employer thought, based upon the interviews or, whatever had been discovered during the vetting process, or as you say, it just doesn't fit in with the culture of the workplace. Then that's an employment issue, and then no employer is forced to obviously keep somebody on. I mean, as in any, employment law is not my area of specialty, but as in any, employment situation, employer has to document, where there have been issues and, has the person been spoken to, and, they can, release them with cause, presumably if they have enough evidence of that, or just, release them without cause and give them their severance, whatever their required notice. And, they're not sort of indentured to them or forced to keep somebody on if they're absolutely not working out. Now, for the employer, the employee, the work permit holder, so what can they do? Well, they might still have status in Canada, at which point, while they're in Canada, they could look for another employer and try to switch their work permit to another employer, and they'd have to go through the same hoops again. But that's another potential avenue. And it's a similar situation if you hire somebody and on a 2-year work permit, and the year in, like, there's a huge economic downturn and business is down. Obviously, an employer is not forced to keep somebody on if they can't afford to. And again, that person, or something happens with the business and they lose a big account or whatever, things happen to businesses that cause them to downsize, then again, they can release the employee, obviously given the appropriate notice or severance. And then that employee can, if they have the time still left in Canada, try to look for other work.
So, okay, so what happens to those fees? Because I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the US, if you bring in somebody to work, a business pays money for that individual's visa, for work permit, whatever. I don't know what the legal terms are for that. But if they then let that person go for any variety of reasons and somebody else picks up the employee, do those costs get moved on to the new employee? What happens? Does the next employer still have costs to pay, or is that done and finished?
Yeah. So yeah, the costs are lost. So whatever cost that the employer has paid in order to hire that foreign worker, they're not refundable, and the new employer would have to pay those costs again.
Got it.
To hire if the employee found a new employer.
So it makes it more difficult for the person to find work again, doesn't it?
It does. So, for the person to find work, they have to find somebody who, they have to have an employer who has a need for that person and that person's particular skill set. And then they also have to have so that's the first thing, the first criteria. And the second would be that you have to have the employer willing to pay the fees, as we've talked about, and willing to go through the necessary process of recruiting and making an application to the government to get permission to hire the foreign worker. So those are the two aspects that an employee who may have lost their job in Canada and looking for another employer would have to have the employer willing to do those things.
So if a person has to go back to their home country, is there a process that's involved in that as well, or do they just go?
So, yeah, they just go. So if they've lost their work and they say, okay, we've given it a try, and I maybe don't really like it here, or whatever the case might be, or I just want to go back to my family, then they would just leave. And Canada at the moment doesn't keep track of people leaving the country. I think that might change in the future, but unlike other countries, but they can just leave. And if there's any dispute later on about whether or not they had left Canada prior to the end of their status, and if they decide they want to go home, they should leave before their status expires. And if there's any dispute, I would tell the client just to keep the passport and old passports if that comes up, and boarding passes and other things like that, just to show entry stamps or exit stamps or what have you in the passport that the person had actually left Canada at some point during the currency of their permit in Canada.
So there's a lot to think about. And from an employer standpoint, what does it round figures cost to bring an employee in and to hire them? Is there sort of a round figure that one should think about if you're thinking about doing this?
So I think it's hard for me to give a round figure because every case is different. So I think really it depends on speaking to the employer and getting an idea of what's involved, and then quoting them plus the fees. Without professional fees, the fee in most cases to make the application to hire a foreign worker is $1,000 per worker, and then the work permit is $150. That's obviously Canadian dollars. So, and the government, that's what you'd be looking at per worker. So you're looking at least 1,000, and then another fee of $85 for biometrics. So, 1,000 plus 150 plus 85 is what you'd be looking at per worker. Okay. Unless that $85 may or may not apply, depending on whether the worker had done biometrics in the last 10 years or not.
So it's not a huge cost to a company.
No,
it's more the legal fees that are going to be expensive.
Maybe yes, but I guess it's not a huge cost, and for most employers who really need foreign workers, and as obviously one of the big topics these days are labor shortages. So companies really are, and companies really are looking for foreign workers to help fill those gaps, and with an aging population as well, without the population being replaced at the same rate, that's the other demographic challenge going ahead in the long term.
So let me ask you, your number one piece of advice to an HR department or a CEO of a company who's thinking about going down this path, what would that be? What would you tell them?
I think my number one piece of advice would be to consult a professional, just to make sure that you're going in the right way. And when I say that, my job, the way that I approach this part of the practice would be to always try to get the client from point A to point B in the quickest and most efficient way. And since there may be, multiple paths or more than one path to bring a worker into Canada, I think a professional could give you those options or say this is the best way to do it, even though they might have thought of a different way. And I think as well to ensure that, because bringing on a foreign worker does entail additional responsibilities, to understand what those responsibilities are. Again, consulting a professional can tell them that, and make sure that this is, what they believe is the right thing for the company. Look, the reality is often today it is, just because it's hard to find people to do certain kinds of work.
Got it.
And as well, as in an economy that's very tech based, there may be people with very which tech based companies may be looking for people with very specific skills that just aren't in large supply in Canada, and therefore really are needed, or have to be looked for outside of Canada.
Got it. So for the employee that's coming, the immigrant, what's your number one piece of advice?
So I think the number one piece would be, obviously think, long and hard about the job that you're accepting, which I guess is advice for anybody who's looking to work somewhere. But but because I think you're making, if you're picking up and moving from another country to a new country that you're not familiar with, and I think you want to make sure that you've made a good choice, and that you wouldn't be caught in the kind of situation that we've talked about before, because the issue that we talked about earlier, because the issue works from both sides, because it can be also an employee who comes and says, look, like, I just can't stand this place, and I dread going to work every morning, and I just can't do it, or I just don't want to do it anymore. And then they're sort of faced with, what if I quit? What can I do if I quit? And so, which obviously they can do. And then, so you need to sort of think about that. Having said that, if you're looking to work as a bridge, and skilled work as a bridge to permanent residence in Canada, I think it's a very good way to do it for a few reasons. Number one, getting a Canada work permit generally is faster than getting permanent residence, and also too, it does allow you to get here, put your feet on the ground, get some a little bit of financial footing, and make it easier to the transition to residence.
Got it. So our time is almost up. What have we not talked about that should be talked about?
No, I think we've covered good ground here this afternoon. I don't know if there's anything, just that, it's something that I've done for many years. And as I said earlier, I practice in all areas. So I practice, on the helping people, people coming and applying for the work permits, but also people who refused to have come to me looking to appeal those decisions. And there's a right of review of refused immigration decisions. And, what I would say, just, from my own personal perspective, and I don't know that necessarily every single immigration lawyer would share this, but from my own personal perspective, I think, working on all sides, ultimately, I think at the end of the day, allows me to serve clients better on all sides, because you really get a better or more in-depth understanding of the regulations. And so that allows you, when somebody comes in and say, okay, yeah, I've seen that before, and this is what happened before, and that led to a refusal. So we need to be aware of that, or this is what we need to do to make sure that that's not a problem, or to address that problem up front.
Got it. Okay. So, boy, if you're thinking of having a international worker, or bringing somebody in from abroad, here is a good resource for you. And Hart Kaminker is in Toronto. Great resource for Canada and immigration law in general. So, Hart, thank you so much for being with us today on Building My Legacy podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
You are so welcome. And for those of you who are listening to Building My Legacy podcast, thank you for being with us. And be sure to remember to visit our website, www.buildtomorrow.com with the number 2, and our second website, the new website, which is www.startwithcollaboration.com. So again, thanks so much, Hart.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell button above. Leave comments. We'd love to hear what you think. And visit our other social media links as well. Thanks much.